Hello, everyone. We want to go ahead and get started. Welcome to Black YA and the Arcade. My name is Dr. Tiffany A. Flowers. I am your moderator this evening. I am also working with Joy Valentine, who is my co-moderator as well as discussant, and so you'll hear from her in just a moment. We're going to start out by just introducing some of the authors. I'll read their bios. We do have some prepared questions for all of the authors, and then we'll open up the floor for the audience to ask questions. We ask that you take all of the questions and put them in the chat. Once you put them in the chat, the discussant will read them aloud toward the end, and we can answer all of your questions in a more organized fashion. Thank you. Our first author is Antoine Bendel. Antoine lives in Los Angeles, California with his girlfriend, where he produces work on YouTube for his own channel and others. Whenever he has the time, he's writing Black speculative fiction, both young adult and new adult. You can find out more about his work by going to www.antoinebendel.com. The book he's going to discuss today is T.J. Young and the Orishas. Our next author is B. Sharice Moore. Raised an only child in Florence, New Jersey, B. Sharice Moore's love of literature was ignited by Roald Dahl's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and Judy Blume's Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing. After earning a BA in English from Rutgers, she began performing her poetry on stages throughout the country. Moore's poems and short stories have appeared in several anthologies and literary magazines such as Chosen Reality, Summer 2020, Issue 1, Fantasy Magazine, These Bewitching Bonds, Mermaid Monthly, and Fire Magazine of Black Speculative Fiction. At present, Moore is a creative writing teacher, the poetry editor at Fire Magazine of Black Speculative Fiction, the host of More Books with B. Sharice on YouTube, and a graduate student at McDaniel College, where she is pursuing a Master's of Science degree in Curriculum and Instruction with a concentration in writing for children and young adults. Her debut YA historical fantasy novel, Dr. Marvelous Dejean's Odd Scholars, is available for purchase wherever books are sold. In her spare time, she enjoys reading to her precocious son, Peanut, and engaging in intellectual spats with her husband, J. Alferon. She lives in Baltimore, Maryland. B. Sharice is represented by Lori McLean, partner agent at Fuse Literary Agency. The book she's going to discuss today is Dr. Marvelous Dejean's Odd Scholars. Our next author is L.M. Davis. L.M. Davis is a YA middle grades author who writes about shapeshifters, aliens, immortals, and witches. L.M. Davis is author of Interlopers, a Shifters novel, Posers, a Shifters novel, Forgers, a Shifters novel, and Skinless, a novel in 3 parts. Davis's shifter novels, which readers call fast-paced, engaging, dramatic, and original, are the coming of age of Nathaniel Pantera, a shapeshifter who can change into a panther, and his fraternal twin, Larissa. Additionally, Davis is a scholar of African American and Native American literatures and cultures, with particular interest in the speculative production of these communities. She has spent more than a decade studying these cultures. Finally, L.M. Davis has worked as a background actor on a variety of science fiction and fantasy projects, including Black Panther, Raising Dion, Spider-Man Homecoming, and Lovecraft Country. She has recently written and directed her first speculative short film titled Favorite Dreams. You can find out more about her on lmdaviswrites.com. Finally, we have Jessica Cage. Jessica Cage is an international award-winning and USA Today bestselling author. Born and raised in Chicago, Illinois, writing has always been a passion for her. She dabbles in artistic creations of all sorts, but at the end of the day, it's the pen that her hand itches to hold. Jessica never considered following her dream to be a writer because she was told far too often there is no money in writing. So she chose the path most often traveled. During pregnancy, she asked herself an important question. How would she be able to inspire her unborn son to follow his dream and reach for the stars if she never had the guts to do it herself? Jessica decided to take a risk and unleash the plethora of characters and the crazy adventurous worlds that had previously existed only in her mind into the realms of readers. She did this with hopes to inspire not only her son, but herself, inviting the world to tag along on her journey to become the writer she always wanted to be. She hopes to continue writing and bringing her signature cage fantasies to readers everywhere. Find out more about Jessica and her work at www.jessicacage.com. So we're going to transition now to our first author. And we'll get a chance to hear from them about their wonderful work. So we're going to start with Antoine.
Okay, I was like, am I allowed to unmute myself now? Because I couldn't do it the entire time.
Right.
Hello, everyone. My name is Antoine Bendel. I am the author of T.J. Young and the Orishas. Book 1 is called Gatekeeper Staff. It is essentially my answer to Harry Potter and Percy Jackson, very similar in particular to Percy Jackson in the sense that you have a young kid who discovers he's like a demigod and goes into this mythology of the Greeks and Romans. And I was like, well, hey, and I have been writing about a lot of Black and African diaspora fiction up to this point, with the Kishi being my first book, which is in Angola folklore. And then I also did By Sea and Sky, which is based more in Swahili and the Caribbean. And so I was like, well, let me do that for kids. Because also I had a lot of parents asking me like, well, there's any books that my kids can read? And I'm like, I haven't done that quite yet. And so growing up, I really loved things like Harry Potter and Percy Jackson. So I was like, well, you can totally do that with another African pantheon, which is the Orishas, which has been getting a little bit more play thanks to Tomi Adeyemi's Children of Blood and Bone, which features a bit of the Orisha. You also have some in media where they show up occasionally. Like I was rewatching City of God, which is a Brazilian film. I think it won foreign film in 2003, if I'm not mistaken. But there's mention of Eshu, who is the gatekeeper himself. And I was like, whoa, like they've been around already. And there's been this martial arts films that, incorporate them. So I decided, hey, let me do it myself. Let me do like this kind of summer camp for a remedial. Well, the funny thing about it is that it's a summer camp for remedial magic users. So it's TJ has not known magic his entire life. He's grown up with it. His mother's like the most famous water sorceress. His sister is known as like the hero of Nigeria. But he has never had magic his entire life until a fateful day where he does, but then he doesn't know how to use it. He's had 13, 14 years of his life where he's never used magic. So he has to be sent to a remedial magic summer camp to kind of like catch up with all the other kids who have had it their entire lives. And in doing so, he, uncovers this big phenomenon that are the Orisha and the adventures that he'll go on with some of them. That is pretty much it, unless you have any like direct questions. But that is like my little intro.
Okay, thank you. That was fantastic. I mean, it definitely made me want to go run out and pick up the book and read it. But of course, I've already picked it up and sent a couple of copies to some relatives as well. Our next author is B. Sharice Moore.
You're muted. I said a whole bunch of stuff on mute. You think I would be used to this by now. Can I share my screen or do we wait till another point in time to do the presentation? Is that now?
You can share your screen.
Right now. Yes.
Okay, awesome. So my book is called Dr. I would worry my mom half to death every time she told me we were going to the amusement park in the summer. And it got so bad until she just stopped telling me. You know, she would just surprise me maybe the day before. And I love amusement parks, and I also love Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And one of my issues, even as an 8-year-old reading Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, was not a single Black, Asian, Native American, Hispanic, or non-white child won one of those golden tickets. And so as a child, I knew that I always wanted to write my answer to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory by Roald Dahl, but I wanted to incorporate other things within my story. So I came up with Dr. Marvelous Jen's Scholars after researching the early magicians, Black magicians of the 20th century. And I stumbled upon some amazing research. I also discovered segregated colored amusement parks that I did not know existed. So Dr. Marvelous Jen is this famous magician, and in 1920, she wants to provide colored folks with an escape from Jim Crow. So she invites 4 young scholars to win these various competitions across the East Coast. And then once they win those competitions, they get to tour her colored amusement park, which is called the Motherland. So the Motherland is an amusement park that is sponsored by Marcus Garvey himself. And it is literally full of exhibits that are based on different places on the African continent. And these are some of the characters we meet. We meet Brenda. Brenda is a descendant of Benjamin Banneker himself. She is an inventor. And she's also a bit of a sticky-fingered thief. All right, next we have Elliot. Elliot is a budding chemist, and his claim to fame is he's trying to find a cure for bigotry in order to avenge a family member who has been lynched. Claire is from Charleston, South Carolina, and she is very business savvy, and she's great with elixirs and tonics. And lastly, we have Omen, and Omen is from Florida, and his claim to fame is strength. He comes from a long line of strong men, and they get into this park, and they experience these different exhibits, and they find out some really curious things about stolen land, time thieves, and they have an adventure of a lifetime that proves quite dangerous. So that's Dr. Marvelous Jen's Scholars.
That was amazing. That was amazing. Thank you so much. Our next author is L.M. Davis. She's going to talk a little bit about her work as well.
Hi, I am L.M. Davis, and I am the author of 3 novels, well, 4 novels now, and I'm going to talk to you specifically about my Shifters novel series, which is, as Tiffany said, the coming of age story about Nate Pantera, who is a shapeshifter. To be more precise, he shapeshifts into a Black Panther, and he and his twin sister, Larissa, are a part of a long line of shapeshifters. And one of the things that I was thinking about, I specifically set out to write YA, and I specifically set out to write I wanted to tell the story of a young Black boy in a fantasy world, because at the time that I started writing, you couldn't really find those kinds of stories. And I had young people in my life who loved fantasy as a genre, and I'm the person who always gives books as gifts. And I wanted to give them books in the genre they loved that had characters that looked like them. And this kind of gives you a sense of when I started writing, because the landscape has certainly changed in the last decade or so. But when I started writing, you really couldn't find a lot of fantasy with Black kids in it. You still can't find a whole lot today, but definitely there are more options available. So Nate and Larissa are shapeshifters. They've always known exactly what they are, but they've always lived among humans. What they discover in the first book, which is called Interlopers, is that there is an entire different dimension that is only filled with were-leopards, and that their mother is the ruler of that dimension. but they only find out, and this place is called Pantaria, and they only find out because their mother goes missing and they have to go into this world to find it. So it's kind of like they think they know what it means to be shapeshifters. They think they know what it means to be Black Panthers, but this story is about them discovering that they only have sort of scratched the surface of that identity. I kind of prepared a reading. Is that okay, Tiffany, or would you prefer? Okay. So today I'm going to actually read a little bit from the second book, which is called Posers. It's not, I've tried to choose a selection that's pretty spoilery, even if you haven't read the first book. This chapter is called Mission Improbable. So one of the things that they discover in the first book is that there are all of these mines that are popping up around Pantaria, and they're doing sort of really a lot of ecological damage. Mission Improbable, and this is Anna's mom, Anna Pantera. She is the mother. As soon as she stepped onto the dead land, the nausea that had been gnawing at her hit her full force. She ignored it and pressed forward, casting a glance at her companions to see whether the land was affecting them in the same way. None of them seemed to be suffering. The hope, which had sprung to life in her chest, faltered. If they could not feel how damaged the land was, their connection to the Fuerza was probably too weak to make a difference. She led them down the steep hill to the shallow ravine towards the mine. With each step, the land grew more lifeless and her anguish increased. The land was dying, and because of her connection to the land, that poisonous energy seeped into her body too. It sucked the life from her in the same way that the Fuerza from healthy land invigorated her. She stopped when she reached the entrance of the mine, unable to take another step. There she gazed into the deep, dark abyss of the unnatural cave that now dominated the side of the hill. Its gaping entrance was something like a hungry, grinning mouth, sucking away the life of her world and mocking her in the process. She wanted to go further into the mine itself, but it took everything she had to bear the continual assault from the earth beneath her feet. Somehow, she knew that in the heart of the mine, it would be a dozen times worse. Let's try here. She was grateful that her voice sounded strong in her ears and much more certain than she felt. She swallowed the bile that rose in her throat. Once we shift, try to use the Fuerza, but instead of drawing it into you, push it into the land. I'll explain that a little bit later if people have questions. She gave the instructions, trying her best to remember how Larissa had described what had happened to her that day in the jungle. They nodded and began to shift. Seconds later, a lion, a jaguar, and a tiger stood at the mouth of a mine, peering at her expectantly. At last, Anna could put it off it no longer. She shifted. As soon as she changed, the impact of the dying land doubled. Her body quaked as all of her strength deserted her. She fought against it, concentrating on pushing both the dying energy and the healthy Fuerza, both of which tingled in every molecule of her being, out of her body into the nearly dead ground. Instantly, the earth began to rumble as the Fuerza poured into the soil. Moments later, the shaking intensified as the power of the other cats, slight though it was, joined her own. The energy spread out from the foreign waves, rolling into the cave, shaking the land around them like an earthquake with an ever-widening radius. Anna watched the ground, fervently hoping that she would see the earth grow healthy and the tiny green shoots spouting out as a result of their efforts. The shaking grew stronger, but no shoots appeared. Then, from deep within the cave, there was a groaning sound. Alarmed, Anna manipulated the Fuerza, using it like sonar to explore the hidden depths of the cave. Yards in front of them, she could see, hear, and feel the wooden beams which held the shaft open, shifting as the foundation stirred beneath them. Suddenly, she heard the deafening crack of one of the central beams, shifting under the weight of the cave roof. Immediately, the other supporting beams began cracking and shifting under the strain of the increasing load. Dust rolled along the floor of the mine, traveling swiftly towards them. Almost too late, Anna realized they were too close. The mine was collapsing, and if they didn't move, it would collapse right on top of their heads. I'll stop there. That's just a little bit of an excerpt. So it's a lot going on, but not only are Nate and Larissa shapeshifters, but they actually have a particular connection to the land of Pantaria. And that connection is what their family calls the Fuerza. And they use it to, and they can use it to do a lot of kind of cool things. So I will stop there, but that's just a little bit of an introduction to the series. And my third book, Forgers, comes out next week.
Thank you. Oh, it's so these excerpts and your explanations of these works is just amazing. We are having the best time ever with you all here. All right, our next author is Jessica Cage. I'm going to allow her to take the floor and discuss some of her work.
Oh, okay. I felt like underprepared. I didn't have a PowerPoint. That was so cool to watch for B. Sharice. But anyway, my name is Jessica Cage. I am an author. I've been writing since I've been writing all my life, but I first published in 2010. And quite like Ellen Davis, I started publishing because I wanted to see more representation in the books that I loved and that my younger cousins loved. So my first book was YA. In recent years, I write more adult and new adult. But my first series is called The Hierarchy Vampires, and it's a blend of fantasy and sci-fi because my mother was a sci-fi queen growing up, so I had to take a bit of her with me. And it's about a young woman who finds out that, or I should say a teenager who finds out that she is next in line to be the queen of an alien race of vampires. And this was my answer to like Twilight, which was really big at the time that I started writing it. And my cousins were so into Twilight, but I found so many issues with Bella, and I was like, I don't like that they always have someone helping her. Why are these men telling her how she's supposed to feel? There were so many problems, and I wanted to give my younger cousins representation of women who figured it out, who got the job done, because I was raised by women who were not having men swoop in and save the day and fix things and guide them. So I wanted to show them that, like, you might not wake up, none of us wake up as Superwoman, but we go on our own journeys and we get there. So that was the purpose of my first series, is to just put the representation out there and give my cousins, who I actually wrote into the story as vampires, to see themselves on the pages and hopefully have them expand their reach with their reading and actually seek out the representation. Again, my first book published 10 years ago, and I wrote the book while I was pregnant. So they put me on bed rest because I was high risk. And I was like, okay, I have to do something to inspire my son. I'm going to bring this person into the world and say, you can reach for the stars. And then here I am working a job I don't like and, just unfulfilled. So during my pregnancy, I like to say I had two babies. I birthed my son and then my career as an author through that time. And it's been 10 years of publishing, and I could not be more grateful for the journey. But I'm gonna cut it short so we can get to the questions. I'm excited about that.
Well, thank you so much. I am excited to get to the questions because I want to kind of hear how you all put your work together and different aspects of how you plan different characters and things like that. Because I know that everybody is really excited. We have a lot of English folks in here, so they're very excited about that. So I'm going to turn things over now to Joy, and she's going to lead us through the questions, the Q&A portion of the panel. And then I'll come in at the end to take care of any questions that we have in the chat. All right, Joy.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. And again, thank you everyone for being here. Authors, we really appreciate your presence, your presentations, and the time you're spending with us this evening. I'm going to start with one of the questions that was first dropped into the chat. And the question is, how do you understand fantasies and liminal spaces as a means to explore identity and agency? And anyone who wants to start? And it looks
it's very
like
funny.
Antoine.
I had an instructor in university who positioned science fiction in particular. He's like, good science fiction isn't just aliens and blasters and spaceships. It's often a social commentary, and a big one would be a Star Trek that did that every episode, where it's some sort of kind of social commentary of what's going on in today's age. And sometimes the only way to get someone to understand it is by presenting it in a fantasy sci-fi element, and then you turn and you say, well, that's just representing Black people, that's representing some sort of oppression, but it's just an alien race in this case, right? And that's the only way to get people to understand it, because they don't want to hear you directly. But if you do it in that fashion. You can kind of trick them sort of into it. I know I spoke about Tomi Adeyemi before, but that was, kind of the foundation for her book, in trying to showcase BLM a little bit by showcasing it through her fantasy world. So for me, it's an easier way of kind of making it digestible for people to get that social commentary.
And for me, I like to think of fantasy as offering a sort of a site of possibility, right? Particularly for Black children who are, so often we get the same narratives about Black childhood, if we get narratives about Black childhood, right? Because there's so many ways that Black children are not allowed to be children. So we get a lot of the same narratives about Black childhood. And what I really wanted to do with my novel was also just tell a different story. Tell a story that's not grounded in, the various, iterations of oppression that, oh man, I'm getting a little using the big words. I heard there are English folk in here, so now I'm like, all the $10 words.
I want to piggyback on you and say that's exactly what I try to do too. Because we always get that one narrative where we only fit into certain tropes, but sometimes you just want to be magical, right? You just want to have a person on a dragon just doing it.
Well, but the other thing is that our lives don't look like the generally narrow narratives that we get. And so when, my kids, their mother is a journalist and their father is a history professor, and these are the experience, these black kids have these experiences. They live in a house in the woods because they're Panthers and they don't want to live in the city. So I just want, so at the bare minimum, I wanted to show just like a different space, a different site where Black people do live. But yeah, as a site, as a space of possibility and a way to escape, right? So I don't have to talk about the civil rights movement. I don't have to talk about Black Lives Matter. I don't have to talk about slavery. I don't have to talk about Jim Crow. Those things are all wonderful to discuss, and certainly we need more books about those as well. But I can talk about a different way of thinking through even sort of identity formation for Black children. And that's kind of what, and that's kind of what draws me to fantasy is to escape the binds a little bit.
Okay.
All right, she froze a bit.
She did freeze. Okay, thank you, Antoine. Thank you, LM. We will hope to get LM back. Any of the other authors want to answer the question about how
Did I freeze?
You did. Are you back? You did freeze. You can continue. We can hear you. Okay, we will wait. Any of the other authors on how you understand fantasies and liminal spaces and all of that as a means to explore identity and agency for our youth? Jessica?
I can kind of piggyback off of what she was saying. Like I said, when I first wrote my series, The High Art Vampires, I wanted to show how we all get to that place of power in different means, right? And that incorporated having characters who had different backgrounds with their parent structures or their paths to success, as was a big part of my upbringing. It was like, you can't do anything that's fantasy. You have to go to work, you have to make money. Some of us had those constraints, but others were able to, explore that. I have friends who went immediately into the arts. I wanted to give these different versions of upbringing and how that affects your mental, spaces when you're approaching life, because I didn't want to have someone being handheld. Like I said, I had to figure stuff out. The women in my life, we figured it out. So it was important for me to show the personal journey, the self-reflection, the therapeutic pathways that we have to take in order to get to that place of power. And yes, I did it by way of vampires and magic and aliens coming from a different universe. Like, it was a lot going on. But I think the thing about fantasy is that it allows you the space to think about those things without having it like thrown in your face. So whether you realize it or not right away, you're watching these characters grow and change and become this better version of themselves. But it's not like punching you with it, right? You get to be like, oh, she just leveled up in power when she, spoke to her goddess. But really, that's like, yeah, she went to therapy, okay? She dealt with some things, and it's a way to get that message across without, again, just kind of beating you over the head with it.
Thank you, Jessica. And LM, now that you're back, is there anything else that you wanted to add, please? You're muted.
I don't know where I dropped out, but I just wanted to just underscore like that for me, fantasy is a site of possibility and a way to sort of break a little bit those chains. That and particularly, I don't know how many people sort of have been following this, but over the last decade with We Need Diverse Books and how that's impacted YA. But still in a lot of ways, we're still seeing stories that come out of the same sites, and fantasy gives us new places to play.
Thank you, LM. Okay, so we have another question that speaks to the mapping of the worlds and ecologies that you authors have created. So how can you talk about what the process was for you and your own personal landscapes and how those landscapes have informed how you created your fantasy landscapes?
Okay, I didn't want to be rude. Of course, that always happens. That always happens.
Right? Like, I'll jump in. Go for it.
Well, the interesting thing for me was that there's 3 major locations in the book. One's Los Angeles, and that's just really based on me. That's like, the whole like write what you know kind of thing. The other is Louisiana, particularly New Orleans. And then we also have Nigeria, Lagos, Abuja, all that. And when we were talking about before, like the diversity of fiction, what I wanted to kind of present is the diversity of Black people in general, because that's the thing, right? We always get this presentation of there's only like 3 or 4 type of Black people, right? But it's like, no, there's many. And even within my own story, I have representation of like the African-American, I have the Afro-Latina, and then I have the Nigerian who's like, living in America for a bit, and how he deals with that, and how there's different aspects of that, and just even different kinds of children. And like, if we all went to, I mean, if we did, most of us probably went to Black schools at some point in our lives, and we all had our friend groups that were just as diverse as any other kinds of friend groups that are, going to be in any other type of school. It wasn't until I got to like high school, middle school, when I started getting more diverse and realizing like I was being pigeonholed, when I'm like, no, I'm just as unique and different as any kind of other boy out there. And that's what I really wanted to do with the landscaping of my book, and having those locations represented, and also the people who inhabit those locations.
Thank you, Antoine. LM?
So I started writing interlopers when I was doing a postdoc at the University of Minnesota. One of my areas of specialization in my work is place studies. And really what I was thinking about, and what you'll see over the course of the 3 books, is I was thinking through how dispossessed people create home. And so, and I as Tiffany mentioned, I study African-American and Native American literatures and cultures. And so thinking about how do you find home sites in places where you're told you don't belong. So if you read through the series, that's because in terms of my scholarly work, which I am not as deeply invested in now. Let me clarify. I'm not invested, but I don't do it as much as I used to. I'm an erstwhile academic, but in my scholarly work, I'm thinking through the ways that African American and Native Americans who are dispossessed of their land and their homes, and African Americans who never really had homes in the United States, or never really were given the space to claim home in the US, how they created home anyway. So one of the things that really comes out through these other dimensions that I create for these creatures, for these people, is how is home created? And I really, my novel Forgers, which comes out next week, is really exciting for me because I'm finally getting to that sort of origin story, which I've been thinking about for years and years, of where these places came from and how they were created, which comes out of my scholarship, interestingly enough.
Thank you.
But don't tell the children that. Don't tell the children who read the book that this is.
Okay, thank you. B. Charisse or Jessica, answer with regards to landscapes or ecologies.
Sure. As far as landscape is concerned, and I also didn't get a chance to answer the previous question, so I'm going to kind of like tie those two together. As far as fantasy worlds are concerned, I like reaching back into the past in order to recreate it. And I think that's what I've done with my novel. So even though it takes place in Jim Crow, I think as adults, we have this belief that young people are well versed in the history of Black people in this country and in the diaspora. And that is absolutely not true. I'm still a teacher, but I was a public school teacher for 12 years. And I taught English, I taught journalism, I taught drama. And I would always kind of like throw in some history here and there to see what my students knew. And I would use it as a teaching opportunity when they did not know something. And I was always shocked by how little they knew. So what I wanted to do with Dr. Jen's Odd Scholars is explore the Jim Crow period, because this period is literally deleted in textbooks. We literally learn about slavery and then civil rights. And we skip over the 100 years of when Black people in this country were probably the most progressive and the most wealthy. And I just became obsessed with this history that I found. And I just said to myself, my God, who knew that there were colored amusement parks in the United States? You know, like there were several of them. You know, it wasn't just one. And who knew that I drove by Suburban Gardens, the place where Suburban Gardens was in Washington, D.C., every day on my way to work. And so I said to myself, my goodness, these places were literally built by Black people, Black architects, designed by Black architects. And this is such little known knowledge. And the fact that I was in love with amusement parks, I would literally go to Disney World and think about how a ride could have been better. I remember it when I was 10 years old and being like, yeah, that was great. But what if they had added this? Or what if they had added that? Or what if they would have done this? And I wish they had done that. And this was always in my brain. And so that's how I came up with the landscape for Dr. Jen's Odd Scholars. I said to myself, okay, what if we had a haunted obelisk, all right? And it's full of souls, all right? Damn souls that are used as fuel for time travel, all right? And that's what I have. And then I thought about the safari. Those of y'all that grew up in the 80s, right? Y'all remember those crazy safaris back in the 80s where you would drive through and they would just say, the signs would say, keep your windows up, keep your doors shut. It was so crazy back in the 80s, right? And I remembered as a child driving through like, oh my gosh, there's a lion. Oh my God, there's a giraffe, what the heck? And this would happen. And so I said to myself, what if there was a safari in this amusement park full of African mythological creatures? And so I began to study the group slang, which is a half snake, half elephant from South Africa, a swallowing monster, a river shutter called Chitfalamfula from Mozambique. I began to study the Jingu of Cameroon. I began to study the Impundulu, which is a lightning bird from South Africa. And I just stumbled upon all this lore. And I said, this is right for the taking. Let's put this all in this park. Let's design this as the motherland. Let's make this, as Antoine said, you know, something that spans the diaspora. You know, I had Professor Blue is a Jamaican time thief. You know, and then we also have, you know, Queen Nanny makes an appearance here. So I used history as hopefully a fun way to make people want to explore more, because there's so much that we don't know. And that's how I designed the Motherland Amusement Park.
And now I want an African Jurassic Park. just based off of that. We need an African Jurassic Park.
And that's literally what it is. It's literally an African Jurassic Park, right?
Thank you, Jessica, or anyone else. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I would say that, okay, one thing is that, and my readers pointed this out to me a long time ago, I did this maybe intentionally, but just not consciously. I tie Chicago, I'm from Chicago. I tied that into my books, every single one of them. So whether it's a location or it's an Italian beef sandwich, or like, and I have my Gin Rebellion series, one of the gin is actually conjuring an Italian beef sandwich. It's just, it's 400 years in the future and he's conjuring a sandwich from, Chicago. But one of the things I've explored recently with my world building is the location, the placements of different cultures, right? Something that I think I didn't really think about when I first started writing is that, and that's current in our current world, is that certain cultures and certain bodies of people, they can't be near each other, right? Because they don't like each other, they're warring, things of that nature. So I created a shared world that I actually invited other writers to write in. So each book is written by a different author. And in doing that, I had to create a map. And we had to really dive into the placements of their creatures. So a phoenix, a dragon, shapeshifters, which is like, where will we place them? Because we don't want, two warring entities too close to each other. We don't want to mess up the balance of light and dark. So these are the things that we have to think about, especially when you're creating a world that's not based on our own. So we actually created another world, its own map, its own rivers and waters. And I didn't think about that in the beginning. How are these people going to live together? How does the landscape, the natural landscape that a phoenix would need, how would that clash with something that the wolves need? Like the wolves need nature. They need to be able to commune with the moon. But if you put them too close to the phoenixes, who are like the sun all the time and they're burning up everything, it doesn't really work, right? It doesn't balance out. So I mean, outside of Tiny and Chicago everywhere, it's been fun and interesting to research the placement of, people in modern America and other countries, and use that as, I guess, kind of like a guideline for how we build worlds in fantasy. And it's like, do you want two major powers too close together? And I try to kind of pepper things out. So it's I would say it's just important to make sure that when you're doing world building, that you're thinking about the types of people and the types of cultures, because each of these people, we thought of them as, their own species, and we built cultures for each species. We built practices for each species. And we kind of try to mimic what we see in the world today. So just taking that into concept, I think that it was very important for us to explore. And I've completely changed the way I do world building now because of it.
Great, thank you so very much. So you talked about some of your connections and how you came up with some of your ideas for your writing. One of the next questions that's a perfect segue to asks authors, how did you come up with your magical systems? So are these magical systems, are they based off real magic, lore, or entirely made up?
It was quite easy because the orishas are all tied to elements of some sort. So my basis of my magic system is mostly nature-based and elemental-based, which is really cool because I think it makes it easier when I can hyper-focus on like a magic system, and also building that in the world, because now I'm setting that up as if Ifa Academy, which is the name of the magical school that they eventually go to, their specific discipline, like people who go to that school, like they seek that out for the specific nature and elemental magic. But then there's other schools out there that might be better with more esoteric or maybe more like ritualistic magic. And me having that catalyst and being able to build off of that is a lot of fun. And I think magic in general is like a lot of fun for most of us because, you can just make up whatever, right? Which is what I do. But I always do better when I have a foundation in something, so that I'm not just building into nothingness and then my tree branches out like way too far. Like you can actually be a little bit more narrow. So yeah, for me, it's definitely like elements and nature, like speaking to animals, changing into animals, changing into trees. I have a tree man. Well, I guess you would call it an int or int. I never can ever say the term, the tree people who are from Lord of the Rings in my story as well. Like, you have grandmother willows too, very similar to Pocahontas. So all that's just fun, right? And talking alligators and giant alligators, the territory with that, like it helps a lot to have a existing lore like I'm using, because I'm using a mythology that is based and rooted already.
Thank you, Antoine. Anyone else who would like to jump in on the magical systems? Are they real, lore, or entirely made up?
Mine is a mixture of not real magic, but lore magic, and what I made up. So for
there is real magic. What are you talking about?
What I'm saying,
no,
I didn't go off of real. I know real magic is there. I didn't use it because I don't know enough, and I was not about to be messy with them. Okay. So I went from the lore, from the books that I read, and then sprinkle my own little touch in there. But it's basically their magic is a derivative of their goddess, right? And you mentioned the willows. I have always loved willow trees. Those are my trees, and they are present in all of my books. In my first book, the willow tree is actually a connection to their goddess. So the main character has to actually commune with this tree, and she's taken into her goddess's world, where she is then, given the full access of her power, right? Not everyone, some people have little magical abilities, and those are her inner circle. But it's really tied to the goddess, right? So it's as powerful as the goddess will allow you. I needed to put some type of rein on her magic. I hate when you read something and they're just all powerful. And it's like, well, why does she need all this help if she can just snap her fingers and everything is happening? So I wanted to put some control on how powerful she could be. And I did that by way of the goddess and the willow tree. And they have to keep this tree healthy, because if the tree dies, then their connection to the goddess dies. And then, the magic is gone. So it became a thing of keeping balance with nature. And then the people who do have the ability to use magic, their magic is based on the elements, right? So we need the earth to be healthy. So we have magic users who can heal the earth. We need water. If we go through a drought, somebody got to come bring some water for the tree. You know what I mean? So these were the things that I tied in as far as like the lore-based magic, but then I used my author pen to say, this is controlled by the goddess. And if the goddess decides that you are no longer worthy, you lose it all.
So my book's actually, well, I guess there's magic, the Shifters novels. And I think it's familiar, but I tried to kind of make it up and have it constructed so that it did what I needed it to do. It's the magic that the Panteras, which Nate and Larissa Pantera, the magic that they have is very limited, and it has specifically to do with, as I said in my reading, that connection that they have to the land. I actually am working on another kind of series. It's not a series per se, but it is a collection of books set in the same universe. And in that, I wanted to, and these books are specifically about what we would call witches, but I would not call them witches. But I wanted to represent a diasporic kind of look at magic. So we have a practitioner in the first book who traces her heritage to Egyptian priestess of the sun god. And so that her magic and her way of understanding how magic works comes through that. But at the same time, I'm always really careful. Like I really want to think about that, because I know that there are people who are believers, right, in these things that I would bring into my books for entertainment purposes. So there's a point where I always do want to kind of diverge and not represent something faithfully, because, or even you will never read one of my books and say, okay, well, now I have an understanding of what Vodun looks like. Because I don't want to sort of co-opt something that is a belief system for people and pull it into my books for the purposes of entertainment. But that's something that I've thought about. And so even as I'm working on this series that has this sort of diasporic witchcraft representation, and all of the different ways that magic has flowed through Black communities, through different spaces over time, I didn't want to say, okay, well, she's a Vodun practitioner. Oh, she is, she's this kind of practitioner. Simply for the purpose that, again, I just want to be very careful not to co-opt something that is not mine for the purposes of entertainment. But that's something I've really been thoughtful about.
Great, thank
For
you.
me, it's probably like a mixture of both real and made up. Well, the inspiration is real. There's a few different magic systems, but I really focus on the time thieves. And my inspiration for the time thieves was the lack of reparations for Black people in this country. I've always been really astounded the deeper I research, 48 years in a mule. And so the time thieves, what they do is they reclaim time. They steal resources. They steal knowledge that is owed to them. And that is their reparations in the book. And so that's something that I pretty much made up. The entire book is about the concept of theft and stealing what's yours, what's mine, and what's ours. And so that's what I pretty much played with a lot. And then I also had artists in my book because I feel that artists are really neglected in this society, even though we need artists. And so in my book, artists are architects of magic. And they have magic that goes from the tip of their fingertips down to the roots in the ground. And they create interdimensional doorways for this time travel that is fueled by damned souls, or the souls of individuals who have taken from people while they were living on the earth.
Thank you very much, B. Sharice. And that leads us to our next question. So the question posed to the authors is, what do you all ultimately hope to achieve through your respective works? Is it one thing? Is it something that varies? And what is it that you are hoping to do as you inspire people to read?
I think it changes over time. I've been published now for 10 years. And when I first published, like I said, it was just so that I could inspire my son. I wanted to show him that there were no limits. If you have this passion, you need to feel that, because I feel like as humans, that's what we're here for, right? We have these creative pursuits, and that's what we need to do in order to live a life fulfilled. Over time, that changed to me actually wanting to reach more children. So I started doing in-class sessions and mentoring with local schools in Chicago, which unfortunately 2020 kind of stopped that from happening. And then now through the last year, I've started to actually reach out and create spaces for other writers who are, vast in age, some people who are still in, middle school, and some who are, in retirement. It's just building a community where people can kind of like this, have a forum where they can discuss these things. Now, of course, personally, I want to see my, books turned into movies and, TV shows and all that stuff. But the purpose of my work is that it's like you want to leave your impression, right? Like when you're gone, you want to have these things that show that, at least for me, that I play my part into putting little Black boys and girls into these spaces and letting them know that it's possible for you to actually see yourself in more than just the box that you grew up in. I grew up on the South Side of Chicago. I was not supposed to be a fantasy writer. You know,
We're
I
about
was
in
not.
Chicago, south side of Chicago. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
No, I went to Kenwood.
Oh, wow. Yep, you were real close to me. So, you know what I mean? Like, the family that I grew up in, they were very limited in their thinking. And my brother and I are these creative artists. Like, we were pretty much pushed out of the family because we refused to be boxed, you know, put in a box. And that is ingrained. You know, I thank my mother probably 3 or 4 times a week for allowing us to be ourselves and to explore those parts of ourselves. And I feel like my work will hopefully show other young African-American boys and girls that it's possible to do more, even if you're not trying to be a fantasy writer, even if this isn't your path. But I feel like these stories, as we were talking about earlier, it shows you that there's more than the limitations that are placed out there. So if I even achieve that for one or two little people out there, then I feel like my work has done what I wanted it to do.
And just to add to that, I am a firm believer that if you can learn to love to read, there's no door that's going to be shut to you. But I also know that, and you all who are in the field know probably better than I do, but I know that there's a key moment where young people start to lose interest in reading. And one of the things that I was thinking, sort of having done no research, is that part of it is if the stories that represent you, that where you see yourself represented, are not stories that you're interested in reading, then that's what gets you away from reading. So I wanted to write stories, you know, and so many young people love fantasy. And when I started writing, there was just very little fantasy that actually had diverse representation at all. And so I wanted to write books that inspired children to love to read. And really with the idea that if they could learn to love to read, if they could continue to sort of immerse themselves in books and immerse themselves in words, that's going to be pivotal for the rest of their lives. Because again, if you love to read, if you know how to go to a book to find information, if you know how to, if a book like B. Sharice's sparks you to study more about the era that she's talking about, and so you go from a fantasy novel to a history book, then the world is your oyster. So that's like my biggest goal is I when I started writing, and you know, I was like I want to be J.K. Rowling. I don't want to be J.K. Rowling no more.
I don't think much of anyone wants to anymore.
No one wants to be her anymore. But you know, but in terms of the reach and what Harry Potter, the books, the woman aside, the books did for a generation of readers, like that's the kind of impact I would love to have. And I think, and of course now I think about it as us collectively having, right? Because the more of us who put these works out there, the more the space opens up for, you know, all of us to contribute, the more these kids will have access to. And, you know, when they finish, you know, Anton's book, they can come pick up mine because it's there and it's out there and it's available. And so that's what I'm thinking.
I want to I know it's not exactly the answering the question, but I do want to piggyback. I think that's really important, that it's not a zero-sum game, like publishing and sharing works. Like oftentimes, if you read a book that you enjoy very much and you're going to move on to that next one that's very similar, right? So I think all of us can build each other up. And I think that's a very vital thing to like get across for publishing.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. As a classroom teacher, one of the things that I really enjoyed was building my classroom library. And I would spend my own money just buying diverse books for students, you know. And one of the things that I also did was we would do drop everything and read. And during that time, I would converse with my students and I would ask them what they like to read. One of the critiques that I have of publishing is I don't know how much these big 5 publishers or any of the publishing companies are really asking students what they want, you know, which is why we have these tropes and these things that are happening, these stories that seem like repeats of what's already been done. And so, to be honest, about 10 of my students were my beta readers for my book. You know, I asked them to read it. I asked them to give feedback. You know, and all too often, I don't know, adults just feel like they know everything. You know, and we know what they should have. We know what they should read. What? Why don't you ask them what they want? You know, ask them, and you get a bunch of different replies, you know. But one of my goals in my class was just saying, hey, what you doing? What book you got? All right, you don't want to read that? Here, look at this. And I love the fact that I gave one of my students, Jason Reynolds' Long Way Down, which is a novel in verse. And it's a fantastic novel in verse. And I also know Jason. But
I'm so glad you're bringing him up too, because that's his mission statement too, is that he just wants Black kids to read, and he just wanted to have something that is readable, because sometimes, you know, you get like maybe sometimes lofty language or subject matters that just don't relate. So he's like, let me just break it down, speak to them how I know they're supposed to be spoken to, and have them read. And that, yeah, Jason is amazing. He's an amazing guy.
Yeah, absolutely. Just have them read, and I would just introduce them to different books, you know, and I think that's really what my mission is. You know, as a teacher, it broke my heart to hear so many students say they hate to read. Like, it's a lot. It's a lot. Like, it's not an understatement when we talk about our students and we go into different schools, and many of them do not like reading and will tell you, I hate to read. I don't want to read Miss Moore. So finding that book, that was just fun. And I also wanted to write a book that wasn't preachy. You know, I didn't want to write a book that necessarily had a moral, a grand moral of the story. I wanted to have a little love in it. I wanted to have fun. I wanted to write an adventure story, because that's another thing that I think is missing. Some of our books are just aiming to preach a bit too much. You know, have these kids go, have the characters go on a quest, have them discover something new, you know, and that's why I got my amusement part. And that's what I'm so to do.
And to be Sharice, and I think that comes out of what the expectation is from the traditional publishing apparatus in terms of what Black books are supposed to do, because I think that you still feel that, even though, again, there's been a great shift in terms of over the last decade. I've been watching it, because my first book came out about 10 years ago as well. And in terms of give us more, we want to publish more books, right? Giving more lip service to the fact that we want to represent diverse experiences. But people of color oftentimes find themselves put in little boxes as to what they can talk about and what parts of their experience are valuable. And I think that a lot of times that's looking through a lens of what it's going to teach somebody. And it's like, Black kids don't necessarily always want to be learning about, you know, their experience, and white kids don't necessarily. And I think that white kids and other kids, if we think across communities, get particular ideas about what books about Black kids are, because so many books about Black kids are those pedantic, preachy kind of books that can be a little bit of a challenge to get through. And I think that for people who are going with smaller presses, people who are indie publishing, I think that we've kind of expanded that a little bit. I think that there's still a lot of work to be done. But yeah, I think that the reason why we see that is it's coming out of how the traditional publishing apparatus approaches publishing people of color, Black people specifically.
I actually want to ask, are all of us indie here? I actually never clarify that at the beginning. Or are some of us hybrid in this chat discussion?
I'm indie.
Hybrid.
There's a
hybrid. Okay, indie. Okay. I just wanted to make sure. I just wanted to clarify. Yeah, I'm indie as well. And I think, Jessica, you're indie as well, correct?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I'm glad you brought that up, because I do think it's very important to uplift the indie space for Black authors, because I think that's where the diverse stories, and when I say diverse, I'm not saying just diverse as in the color diverse, I'm talking about the subject matter is diverse, is in the indie space. And that goes for the larger indie world just in general, right? Because traditional publishing, they are, you know, they're first and foremost trying to make a profit based on numbers and, you know, analytics and that sort of a thing. And sometimes you just got to go directly, like you were saying, B. Sharice, just going directly to the kids or going directly to the readers or whatever. And I feel like indie does that very well because, you know, there's no gatekeeper or middleman. You're the middleman, if you want to call it that, is your reader itself.
I think that indie authors also, excuse me, expand the range of what's out there. And that's what I find. As somebody who invited all of you to the event, I'm always looking for something different. I don't necessarily want the same storylines in every single, I do these panels all the time. And I try to make sure I invite different authors every time because I want to amplify different voices. That's really important to me. I'm also concerned that, especially when I think about African-American students or African-American writers, I come from a writing community. I'm from Chicago. I grew up in a writing community in Chicago. And I worry that when people always take every single piece of writing to a larger company, I think a lot of the culture is lost. A lot of the experience is lost because you're sitting around in a room with people who don't necessarily understand your culture, know it. And they're like, well, why is this in the book? And I hear that from so many traditionally published authors, and listening to them cry about how the best parts of their work were taken out. And it just really changed the whole nature of the book. It was almost like after a while, they were like, it was just so stale because they were trying to shift the book and make it for more of a mainstream audience. And so I think that indie authors, particularly Black indie authors, tend to just write the culture. You know, that's what they do. And they don't really apologize for that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that it's really refreshing to read those books. So I try to, you know, when I invite people, I try to invite just different authors, people who are traditionally, people who are indie, people who are both, to every panel that I do, because I think it expands the range of what's out there. And so people can see that there are more books. Because you're going to find the majority of the books, particularly for African-American authors, because this is my research area, actually are self-published, the majority of them.
Mm-hmm.
And the rise of indie publishers is what's giving Black children choices right now. All right, I'll turn things back over to Joy.
Thank you, Tiffany. Okay, so the next question, and Jessica, you briefly touched upon this. Someone in the chat writes, how would you like to see your book adapted? Would you like to see a mini TV series, a film? What's your choice? If you could do that right now, what's your choice?
Well, okay, I'll go first on this one. I currently have 26 published titles. So I see those happening in different ways, right? Like the Gen Rebellion series, I would love for that to be like, you know, box office, you know, this is on the big screen, right? But then my Siren series, I would love for it to be episodic, maybe on HBO, because it is like a little bit more on the adult side. So it's just, it ranges depending on the project, right? Because I think when my the Gen Rebellion series is more of a like Marvel type feel. It's all these superpowers coming, and you know, you have all these different people with their own backstories that we're building up to. So I really see that more of like a Marvel cinematic experience. But then my YA series, which is The Hired Vampires, I would love for that to be more episodic, where we can kind of dive into each of the characters a little bit more deeply and see where their journey is. So I think it just depends on the work, right? But either way, I'm down for it. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not turning that away because that is one of my goals.
For the Shifters novels, I would love to see them as a series and as a series, because again, I think, you know, as a limited series, so because I think there's some amazing world building that can happen, but I think in order to sort of tease out all of the different relationships and that sort of thing, you need a little bit more than a 2-hour movie. Interestingly though, I have a novel called Skinless that is about, which is only available in ebook format right now, but it's about an alien refugee girl who has come to Earth with her mother to escape genocide on her planet. And I'm actually going to make that into a web series that I'm going to write and direct myself. You heard it here first, folks. That's going to be my next I think film project. I got to raise the money, but but I think that's the next thing that I'm going to do. And Tiffany mentioned that I recently directed my first short film, and so now I'm kind of like I've done it once. I get, you know, and I don't, it's another arena where I don't necessarily have to wait for somebody to say, hey, we're gonna green light you. I can green light myself once I raise the money. Always the big deal.
I'm sure you'll get it done. Anyone else want to answer that question?
Really, I would just say television series, and I'm into series more for novels in particular, because I feel like a lot gets lost with the movie because it's limited, you know, to 2-hour time period. But with a series, you get 10 hours, 12 hours, you know, and you can expand on that and really go deep into, because the thing that you sometimes lose from like the novel is like the internal thought or like the internal struggle or you know, the buildup of that, because it's very rush in a movie format. So for me, I've always been someone like, there's several movies that have come out, like, or now I like that more and more have been showing up on like Netflix or Amazon or HBO, where TV is more sought after kind of now than movies, especially after 2020. So yeah, I'm totally a series guy here for sure.
Yeah, same here. Hopefully, you know, like a Netflix or Hulu or Amazon, the adapted series, that would be my dream, definitely.
Does anybody have any choices as to who they'd like to see star or play in any of the roles?
That's actually a really good question. Well, I actually did cast people, and I don't know if you guys also do this as authors, but do you guys cast people when you're writing? Like in your head, you're like, oh, this person is this actor. Like for instance, I have a Mr. Dubois in my book. He's basically, oh my God, I'm forgetting, I just blanked on his name, but Gustavo Fring from Esposito. What is his name? Giancarlo Esposito. Gentleman who, you know, Better Call Saul, or not Better Call Saul in Breaking Bad, he was Gustavo Fring. He's what I imagine as like being that teacher for his sister, for TJ's sister. I was imagining Lupita in that role. So yeah, I definitely do that kind of thing. Like where I'm like, let me imagine an actor that I know, and I'll cast him in the role as like I'm writing it.
For mine, the Hierarchy Vampires, I always thought Felicia Rashad would be, she's literally the only person I cast as far as like known actresses. But she was like the Earth Mother, like the former queen who's passing on the torch, right? I was like, that's her. It was the messages through her character as Claire Huxtable that I really tied to the grandmother in the series. So I was like, oh, she would be perfect. But I honestly would love to see new people. It's kind of like we see the same people over and over, and I want to be able to explore other avenues with that. Like just like us as indie authors, like there's this gate that we're trying to, or a lot of people, because I never even tried to do traditional publishing, but a lot of people spend their time like banging on, like, let us in. And it's like, I don't want to do that to act. I see so many amazing little known actresses out there and actors. And it's like, can we give them a chance? Like, I would love for my work to bring somebody else and help them kind of open the gate for their own career. But
I was actually talking about that with my girlfriend. We were watching Death, Love, and Robots, that short series that they do on Netflix, the little shorts, and then they don't really cast except for Michael B. Jordan, who showed up in one of the shorts, right? And that was the one that took me out of it, right? I couldn't get invested into the story because I'm like, oh, I'm watching Michael B. Jordan,
right?
Michael B. Jordan. But all the other ones were just like unknown likenesses or unknown actors, and you're way more invested in that world. Even with Harry Potter, like, you know, like those kids were not known. And so now when you look at them, you think, oh, they're those characters. So I definitely agree with that. Like, even for voiceover work, like sometimes you hear a documentary and you're like, does Morgan Freeman have to do another? Can we have like, can another voice actor who needs work do that role? So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that's a very important like option that, you know, should be used more often.
And I think also it's just a matter of how many established actors and actresses or actors are there that are young kids of color that would fit the diversity of the roles that would be offered in any of our books. Like, I can't think right now.
You have the kids on
Oh,
Blackish, maybe.
right, but see, but
My
And that's, I mean,
That would take
um,
me completely
well,
out of the
actually,
world,
actually, for
honestly.
right, because you're
skinless,
thinking about those
for
kids, right?
skinless, Yara Shahidi might work. Yara Shahidi might work for skinless, but again, I'm doing that as a web series on my own, so I don't know if Yara Shahidi will sign with me. But yeah, and I think that yeah, I think that that's your point, Jessica, about unknowns, because again, I mean, I think everywhere we look in terms of culture, we see repetition, right? We see the same actors and actresses, we see the same types. So if you have a series that has a character that is outside of a particular kind of type, then you're gonna have to find someone unknown anyway, or relatively little known, because we see the same people kind of elevated over and over again. But yes, so if mine would likely mostly be fresh faces, if it went to Netflix.
And same for me, definitely fresh faces. The only person that I think that I would love to see is Dr. Marvelous Jen and Simone Missick. And she was in Luke Cage. And I really enjoyed her, or even Mia Long. I could possibly see her, or Janelle Monáe. But as far as the kids are concerned, I really like Pryor Ferguson. She was in Stranger Things, and she plays like the smart alecky little sister of Caleb McLaughlin. So I like those two actors for like Brendan Elliott. But other than that, it's kind of difficult, especially because, you know, one of the actors is Caribbean of Caribbean descent. And so I don't know any, you know, young actors of Caribbean descent at all that I can name off the top of my head. So it would definitely be a cast of unknowns, and hopefully Simone Missick.
Great, thank you so much. So moving back into the whole young adult book genre, we have a couple of questions. So one question is, how do you as authors think of young adult versus new adult? And then the other question is, what is the age range for your particular books? So young adult versus new adult.
Yeah, we were talking about this in the chat a little bit. For me personally, I know this definition like varies between like each person you speak to, right? But for me, YA in particular has to do with those teen years, particularly in high school. New adult for me, the transition is like university, kind of when you're stepping out of the home and you're kind of discovering what kind of adult you'll be when you start making those terms of like adulting and stuff like that. That's like a new adult kind of like, that's the switch to me, is high school, university.
The books that I'm working on that are about the witches, I would almost describe those as new adult. And I think I think for me, it is a maturity level of the characters. I call them YA because my characters are, for one book, the main character is 17, but it's set in 1950. So there's just a different level of expectation in terms of the maturity. You know, like 17, you might almost be married.
Right.
Well,
yeah,
I mean, it's still the case today, but it's not the case.
I mean, you can make a case that new adult extends to like age 30 nowadays. You know what I mean? Like you could say new adult goes all the way there. You know?
Right. It's just like when, you know, in 2021, what it means to be an adult is very different from, you know, in terms of like pinning down an age range. It's very different if you said a book in 1920, like a B. Sharice's book. So I think to me, it's the maturity of the characters, and that can happen at any age, depending on what the expectations are of the world that you created for that character. Yeah, I guess, and then of course for new adult, for me as a because my books are kind of like that, they straddle in middle grade and YA. So I was very careful in terms of, I'm very thoughtful about what I wanted to include in terms of what I wanted to showcase for the kids in the age range that I was going to see. So new adult also opens up space to to do some other things that I wouldn't necessarily want to represent to a younger audience. Like, so there could be more, for me, sex. Like, I know there's sex in YA, but for me, I don't choose to represent sex very heavily in my books. But new adult is a space where you can sort of explore that aspect of romantic relationships a little bit more.
I think that's what the creation of new adult came from initially, was specifically that caveat of sex. I think that's what made that genre its genre.
And it's kind of struggled a little bit. How do people feel about new adult? Because I don't really feel like that's it. It kind of.
I think only authors know about it. I don't know if readers really.
Well, that's what I was saying. I don't know if it ever really took hold in the public imagination.
But I think that's an excellent question to put on everyone's mind. You know, what do you think about new adult? And for those who are in attendance here today, you know, have they ever even thought about the differences between the two? I think that's a great question to think about.
And it's really interesting. I have a book on submission now, and it's a YA novel in verse. And like, I've gotten some interesting feedback from different editors, and like one editor said that it read like middle grade. And I was just shocked, like, what? What do you mean? It reads like middle grade. It was, I don't know, you know, I know this wasn't a question, but going back to what Jessica said about knocking on that door of publishing, it is extremely hard. And that's the reason why I'm hybrid. You know what I mean? The stuff that the big folks or the traditional folks won't take, I go on and I find somebody to put it out, I'll put it out myself, you know? And ironically, you know, though I have an agent, my agent is really working hard to push Dr. Marvelous Pens Hot Scholars, even though it's not traditionally published, you know, because she sees that, you know, it has a lot of promise and there's a lot of buzz around it, which is great. So some of the stuff we really don't have any control over, you know, like, I don't know how much you all realize, like, these gatekeepers are serious, you know, when it comes to writing. And it's almost like, you know, there's a number of diverse authors that you cannot exceed. Like, okay, you can only have.
There can be only one.
You can only have 5. You know, Black folks. That's it at once, and then you can only have maybe 3 Native American folks, and after that, and it's really crazy, and it's limiting, and it's really sad. So I'm going to do both. And as far as this new age and young adult, and then like Ellen Davis was saying, there's this weird middle ground between middle grade and YA, you know, because I really believe my work is like lower YA. But it's weird because some of the students kind of get lost because they're like, okay, I'm too old for middle grade. You know, I'm not 12 anymore. I'm not 11. But then I'm not old enough to be talking about being in the sheets with somebody. You know? Or well, they might be, but you know what I mean. You know, my mama probably don't want me reading that. So it's these really interesting, you know, categories, and they're not created by the authors nor the readers. It's the editors. Like, these are the folks that make the decisions as to what's what. And that's another conversation, because there are a lot of great editors that I absolutely appreciate, but a lot of them, I wish they would find something else to do.
So I will say, when I first published the Hierarch Vampires, it was upper YA, right? And then 3 years into it, it was pushed into new adult.
Right.
And then 3 years after that, it was pulled back into upper YA. And I think that's really driven by the readers themselves, right? Kind of like Ellen Davis, what you said, the maturity of the readers change with generations. So what my son is reading now at age 10 is not what I was reading at age 10. It's a lot more mature. So we also base that off of their ability to absorb and process the information that they're taking, right? Because a lot of times I didn't know if I was able to talk about YA because I didn't know if my books qualified anymore. I had to go back to the drawing board and check what the current, like you said, the editors decide. So what are the editors saying now? You know, because there is a kissing scene in my book. So is that okay for YA now? You know what I mean? So it's those type of things. And the cast of characters, the main 5 characters, they range in age from 17 to 20. So it's like part of my cast is on the new NA side and part of my cast is on the YA side. Is that okay? You know what I mean? Because they're dealing with different things. So it honestly, I just put it out in my mind. I tell myself I'm going to write these stories that are true to the characters that I'm writing and trying to represent. And the readers will find it and I will, you know what I mean? But if you're trying to write specifically for YA, then you need to go and make sure that you're abiding by the guidelines, because even some of the promotional tools that we use, they won't accept your work if it's not specifically within those guidelines, which is, I was like, wait, what? So there was a gap of 3 years where I couldn't use those specific avenues to promote my work because it was just a little bit outside of the guidelines now. And now all of a sudden it's okay again. So it is changing. And like you said, the authors, we don't have any control over that. We just have to kind of work inside of these lines and hope that our work doesn't get pushed outside of the boundaries.
And speaking of working inside of minds, and because we have so many educators here this evening who will be using books, who do use books, the question now is, how do you envision your work being used in classrooms?
I really hope it's a jumping off point of looking into African mythology and African lore in particular, in the same way that, you know, you'll get like in middle school, you'll get like Japanese mythology, you know, when you have your world history, you'll have Greek, Egyptian, you know, Roman, that, you know, trifecta there. I would love it if, you know, a teacher read my book and then, you know, a student's like, wait, what are orishas? You know, like what is that even? And then them looking that up and being like, oh my God, there's like a lot of awesome lore here. And oh my goodness, they look like me and they are supposed to represent, you know, where my people came from. Like that would be, which is a joy to me, because actually recently I just had a young reader, 15 years old, who really loved the book. So I sent him a signed copy, like open it and like seeing his experience with it and him talking about specifically saying like, you know, if you're tired of Harry Potter, like, you know, this is a really good one to read, and having just those sorts of reactions and seeing that, I think is really important to me. And also just to further education that there is more than just Eurasian, you know, mythologies out there.
For me, I actually am studying, I'm about 6 credits away from my master's in curriculum writing, and I've written curriculum for 2 different school districts that I worked for. And last year, I actually spearheaded a campaign for Conjuring Worlds, which is an Afrofuturist textbook for middle school students. And Ellen Davis and Jessica Cage are both appearing in that book. So that should be here later this summer. It's kicking my butt. It's more work than I ever imagined, but it is almost finished. I just hope that my work is interdisciplinary. You know, that is so important. And I love work that can be cross-curricular. So work that you can study in a science class, work that you can study in a history class, work that you can study in an ELA class. And that's what I'm hoping that Dr. Marvelous Jen Scholars does. And actually, that is what it does, because I've already created, you know, curriculum and extension activities to go along with the story anyway, so that I know that it does that. Just all too often, one of my biggest critiques of American public schools is that these subjects operate in their own silos. So our students are trained to think, oh, ding, 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 it's time to go to math, which has absolutely nothing to do with the history class I just left. Ding, 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 it's time to go to science, which absolutely has nothing to do with the history class nor the math class that I just left. And that is a source of the reason why so many of our students they hate school. Like we don't like to say it, but the students don't like to be there. They don't want to be there. They don't like it. And it's because everything is separated. But we need to go back to the basics and talk to our students about how interconnected these things are. And I love Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. And I often use it when I'm designing curriculum. because there are so many students who have these different talents and these different ways of learning. And as educators, we really aren't tapping into the students who are bodily kinesthetic learners, students who are naturalist learners or verbal linguistic learners. Well, no, let me backtrack. Verbal linguistic learners and logical mathematical learners have the edge over all other learners because we're going to test them. We're going to ask them to do a math test, and we're definitely going to ask them to write an essay or do something regarding reading. That's all we test, all right? But what about the student that can show you what they know by drawing? What about the students that can show you what they know through music or through dance or through discussion? So it's my hope that I've created a book that is cross-curricular, that all subject areas can hopefully draw from and students can get the most out of.
I actually want to piggyback off of that because of what you said about the education part, because there was a question earlier from a Melissa who wanted to talk about, like, you know, how, because we talk about like magical schools and a lot of our things, you know, how's that equate? And that's actually a theme, an exact theme, what you just said in my book, because TJ, his magic is new and he has to be put into this curriculum where they don't know how to teach him, you know, that magic, because it's like, well, we've never seen this before. Like, how are we supposed to do it? Which is something that I'm glad to see that is actually something that's happening in reality. And it's an important thing to have out there.
What's interesting for me is that the variety of things that I get back from readers about what they see in my book, I think suggests that it would lend itself to a lot of different conversations. When I was writing this story, I really was setting out to write a story about a boy coming to really understand who he was and his power in the world. So any kind of way that you might have that, any way that you might integrate that into your classrooms, that kind of conversation about, it's really a personal growth book. And that, you know, and people say, okay, well, I see strains of reflections on 9/11. I was like, oh, do you? Okay, good. I know that there's definitely an environmental component. So to be Sharice's point, this could be taught in a class, where you're or in a unit about sort of environmentalism and thinking through sort of what we do to the land and what that ultimately means. But really, ultimately, it's about a kid making mistakes, growing in his knowledge of who he is, and making better choices on the other end of that growth. So however that would work into the conversations that you were having, I see this book working well, and these books working well in that vein.
For me, I didn't ever imagine my work being in anybody's classroom. I was writing for entertainment. If anything, my book is on the shelf in the back of the room where they go and they sit and they read and escape for a little bit, right? And that's where my books are. The Hierarchy Vampires are currently in 7 different classrooms. The teachers have reached out to me and asked me this, and I'm like, absolutely, I will send you books for your babies, let them read. And of course, these are upper classrooms. I'm like, what class level are you? No first graders, you know? But that's where I see myself. I always wanted to write work that just let you escape, you know, and explore. And like I said, there are these hidden things in there that you can ponder on. And if you don't, that's quite all right. Just have fun in the space. So in recent years, to have been kind of embraced in this area of having conversations like this and working on B. Sharice's project, I was like, wait, who, me? Like, I'm just writing to entertain, you know what I mean? But then you have to sit and reflect, and there are messages and meanings. And one of the classrooms, she had the students use my books, and they all wrote me little letters about what they took away from it. And I say little as if they're like, you know, 7 or 8, these were like teenagers, but it's eye-opening to see how your work affects someone, even if you didn't write it with that vein. Because I think about those like memes where they're talking about the teacher is like, what did she mean when she said the curtains were crimson and da 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 da, and then they're trying to dissect it, and then the author was like, The curtains are
They were
crimson.
just crimson. Yeah, they just were red. Sorry.
There was no other meaning to it. So it's like if people can learn and take from it and grow, perfect, but I'm here to entertain.
That's funny.
Okay, everyone. I just wanted to kind of close us out. I wish we could have there were so many more questions in the chat. I wish we could have gotten to them, but we're actually out of time. Whenever I do these panels, the time goes by very, very quickly. But I want to thank all of the authors that agreed to come out today and, present and talk about their work and discuss their work with the audience at the Children's Literature Association Conference. And I hope you'll consider joining us again. You all were amazing. I learned so much about your work. I'm going to be promoting your work for the next 2 years. I'll be including it in my book. So thank you so much for agreeing to come out and work with us today.
And those of you who didn't get your questions answered or want to engage more, definitely find us on social media. I'm always up for more conversation.
Please talk to us. We're a lonely kind of people. I love it when I get emails from people and I think people don't want to be bothered. No, bother us, please.
But if the authors, because this is recording, if you could just let people know where to find you on social media, they can follow you and they can follow up with you and invite you to other events to discuss your work. So Antoine, you want to go?
So I'm Antoine Bendel. You can find me at antoinebendele.com. I think my name is listed like right below me, right? Yeah, so that's just that. Also social media, Google, you'll be able to find me everywhere. YouTube will probably show up first, but YouTube is definitely a different space than my like publishing stuff. So just make sure you're looking at the publishing side of things.
Okay. All right, Jessica?
So my website is jessicacage.com. You can Google me. First of all, I have to celebrate that I have officially surpassed Jessica Jones and Luke Cage on Google. So that is
for the SEO.
They took over my Google search. I was like, no. But I am J. Cage, author on all platforms, and I do live discussions on TikTok 3 nights a week. So follow me there.
All right, thank you.
I'm going to just share my screen real quick if I can.
Yes, that's fine.
So everybody can see it.
Okay.
Did I share it?
No, it definitely didn't come. Okay, yes.
Okay, so there's my contact. I am at LM Davis Writes across all platforms, but I'm also www.lmdaviswrites.com. But I wanted to put that in the video. So that's why I shared my screen.
Okay. Thank you so much. Okay. B. Sharice.
How do I unshare?
I'll do it.
There we go.
I'm B. Sharice, Facebook, just send me a friend request. It's at b.sharice.more. I think that's what it is. Yeah. Twitter at Sharice_B. Instagram at b.sharice. And you can find me on the website, bsharicemore.com.
All right. All right. Well, thank you all for sharing your information, and you all make sure that you look them up and follow them on social media platforms to keep up with them. All right, everybody have a good evening. Take care.
Thank you all for coming. Thanks for the great questions.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.